2020 has been yet another year marked by example after example of the unequal and inhumane treatment that Black Americans tend to receive from law enforcement. The protest movements that continue to grow around these examples have rallied around the controversial demand to defund the police. So far, Joe Biden has been unwilling to co-sign this demand, and frustration is understandably growing with activists, voters, and even some politicians who feel like every time we get momentum behind large-scale change, a public figure like Biden is there to pour cold water on it. But is he wrong? From the perspective of trying to win an election, Joe Biden's position is a pretty easy one to take because defunding the police is generally unpopular. Recent polling suggests that 65% of Americans reject the proposal. Only 45% of Black Americans and just 50% of Democrats say that they support it. So yeah, it functions pretty poorly as a campaign slogan. But just because it's unpopular doesn't necessarily make it bad policy. And sometimes leadership means getting behind unpopular policies if the policy is good enough. After all, it took over half a decade for the ACA to become popular. So, is defund the police good enough policy that Biden should be using his political capital to advocate for it despite its poor polling numbers? That's a pretty tough question to ask, let alone answer, given that those advocating for defunding the police don't necessarily agree on what that means. It can mean anything from simply revisiting budgets all the way to complete and total abolishment, depending on who you're talking to. On the other hand, those who are against defunding the police are comfortable accepting the standard definition of the word defund and assuming that it means there will be no more police. Now, when you're an activist, having a volatile slogan has legitimate utility. You'd rather have a slogan that gets a lot of attention, even if it might overshoot a little, rather than one that perfectly describes your goals but is boring. That extra attention comes with more time to explain your ideas, and it gets you in front of more people. It gives you a platform. On the other hand, if you're a politician, you don't want to spend all your time on the campaign trail trying to explain why the slogan you're using isn't necessarily as objectionable as it seems. And to be fair, there are people who literally mean they want to defund the police. Then there's the question of whether or not a President Biden could even defund the police at all. I want to be really clear here. Police departments are beholden to the communities that they police. If those communities decide that their police departments are causing more harm than good, then who could really blame them for refusing to put up with it any longer? But at the end of the day, police departments are overwhelmingly funded by state and local governments. Federal funding really is just a drop in the bucket. Biden could rescind every federal dollar that's given to every police department, and the vast majority of them would suffer very little, if any, ill effects. So this begs the question, what exactly is Biden refusing to defund? Much of Biden's police-oriented policy proposals are regulations, like a ban on chokeholds or banning military-style weapons and equipment. The stuff that would actually cost money are a national standard for the use of force, better data collection, and a $300 million investment in something called community-oriented policing services, or COPS grants. Now, these COPS grants would in large part go to hiring more police officers. And while the data is mixed, there is some research that suggests that more cops can result in safer communities. Of course, that depends on the cops, and that depends on the community. If it were me advising them, I'd tell them to stay away from those COPS grants. There's too many examples of them turning into perverse incentives for the police. And those perverse incentives usually come at the expense of Black Americans. But I'm not advising them, so here we are. But what about those other expenditures? As far as I can tell, experts, academics, and activists all agree that we desperately need better data on police effectiveness and a national standard for the use of force. There are 18,000 different law enforcement agencies across the country. Getting them all to submit standardized data on how they do their job is going to cost a lot of money. But without that data, we cannot conduct a good cost-benefit analysis on policing. Also, that data is going to help a lot for when a community does decide that it's time to disband their police. We can use that data to figure out what to do next. Because right now, we're basing a lot on anecdote and educated guesses. Then there's the national standard for use of force, which is key in ensuring that the DOJ is fully enabled to take legal action against police departments that are violating the rights of the people who live in the communities that they police. Right now, all 18,000 of those law enforcement agencies operate under differing standards, which makes it way harder for the DOJ than it needs to be. But again, that standard is going to cost money. Biden needs to walk this line really carefully. Activists aren't necessarily wrong in feeling like he tends to prioritize so-called moderate voters. And at the same time, polling does show that the majority of Americans support police reforms. His proposals have weaknesses, but he also supports the reforms that we need most from the federal government. But we need to keep in mind that he can't simultaneously run on those reforms and run on defunding the police. He's going to have a really difficult task in ensuring that the money that the federal government spends on the police improves the situation. But I think so far, his response to defunding the police has been the right one. Thank you for watching another video. I hope you are enjoying watching them as much as I'm enjoying making them. As always, comment down below, tell me what you think about these ideas. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so more people can join into the conversation. And I'll talk to you next week.